All right, so today's lesson is about peaks, clusters, and outliers. If you think of what a peak is, a mountain peak, you won't be surprised when I tell you what a peak is. When you also think of a cluster, like if you're watching a sporting event or something, you see a cluster of players, a group of players, that probably won't surprise you either. Outlier, if you think of outside or far away being on the outside or outer edge of town, that might not surprise you either. So to me, the vocabulary terms make sense, and I'm hoping that they make sense to you as well. If you have not printed out your notes, that's fine. You don't necessarily have to print them out each time. You can always just go through the slides with me and just repeat the lesson if you need to. I surely don't want you running through a complete print cartridge just to finish out the school year. Okay, so peak is most frequently occurring value in a line plot. So a peak is where your mode is, okay? It's that top point. A cluster is a group that's closely together. Outliers are values that are much higher or much lower than others. You're going to tell because they'll be way out on the side. A gap, if you're looking at like a line plot or a histogram, it means there's no value at that particular place. And then skewed, we'll talk about skewed as well. It tends to have a long tail on one side or the other. So let's see. So as you can see, we also have what's called symmetry. You've known symmetry for a long time. Symmetry is probably not going to surprise you. This first graph here is not symmetric. It doesn't look the same on one side or the other. Although it does have a gap at 9, it also has another gap at 13, and it has a peak at 10. Okay, so it's non-symmetric. This second dot plot here has a good size gap. So it's got 2 clusters from 16 to 18 and another cluster from 22 to 25. Because you can see there's a pretty good size gap between the two. So the gap is 19 to 21. It doesn't have any outliers because it doesn't have any stuff way off to the side all by itself. And it has a peak at 22. That's where it pokes up. So if we're looking at this one, this is negatively skewed or skewed to the right. Okay, that means most of the data is on the right side of center. And this one is positively skewed. So it's skewed left. In 6th grade, we call it skewed right and skewed left. That's what they would call it on the STAR test when you see it next year. And then the middle one, they say it has no skew, but we call it symmetric. So you've got skewed right, skewed left, and symmetric. All right. So on this one, we're going to look for peak, cluster, gap, and skew. Sometimes we're going to say none. It really just depends on the graph. So let's look and see what we have. So we have a peak of 20 to 29 because it's a histogram. We have a cluster from 0 to 49. That's where most of the data is. We have an outlier. Oh, advanced too quickly. We have an outlier at 90 to 99 and a gap from 50 to 89. This one is skewed left. Although it doesn't say so, it is skewed left. All right, next one. As you can see, this is kind of a funky one. If it was nice and symmetric, each chunk of the box and whisker plot would be relatively the same size. As we can tell by looking at it, it's not even close. We don't have, maybe the two on the right are close to the same size. But remember, if this is 25% and this is 25%, if they're not the same size, it's not like evenly distributed data. Plus, it looks like we have a bunch of dogs that are heavy set and not too many little dogs in the dogs that they weighed. Because if it's close between if half of them are between 160 and 200, if they did 50 dogs, 25 of them weigh more than that, which is a lot of weight going on there. So we have a peak of 200. Okay. There's no peak on this one, so disregard that. There is no peak, or you can't do peak on a box and whisker plot, so that is not correct. Because we don't have any individual data at all except for the 200 and the 40, we can't tell whether we have peaks or not. We do have a cluster from 120 to 180. That's a cluster in the middle. We have an outlier at 20. We have a gap between We do not have a gap between 40 and 120. We have a gap between 20 and 40. And this particular graph is skewed right, which means most of the data is on the right side. This one here, ooh, I like that. Doesn't that look pretty? I like them when they look that way. All right, so this one here is a U-try. When you're looking at it, think about, does it look the same on both sides? Does it have a tall spot? Okay, so that's a U-try. Now let's look at this one, practice 4. All right. That one's also a U-try. So think about the peaks, clusters, gaps, and skews. All right, if you have any questions on your ticket out, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Have a great evening.